African Ascent International welcomes Victor Wallis, professor of political science and political theory, among many other things, and an ex-editor of one of the leading journals in the country, Socialism and Democracy, a writer of 4 books and more. I will get an opportunity to ask him to introduce his books at the appropriate time. I consider him to be one of the pillars of African Ascent International, which is the television program that I host and I direct. African Ascent International proudly announces that the Hutchins Center of Harvard University is one of its sponsors, as is Berklee College of Music. And I myself happen to be a professor of philosophy at Berklee College of Music and also Harvard University's summer school. And I'm the host and director of African Ascent International. Welcome to African Ascent International, Victor.
Thank you, Pedro. It's a pleasure to come back again.
It is such a pleasure to see you every year or so to give us an analysis of the state of the country and also the world, because you're one of its vigilant and astute observers. So what I thought we should devote this particular episode to is really this monumental election, which is in the making in the US, namely the election for 2024. Why don't you give us your overview analysis of the hopes and challenges that this particular election is going to pose to the world, in light of the fact that analysts of the American situation, such as Eric Wolf, are judiciously but boldly characterizing that the American empire is in decline, and in that some of the reckless behaviors that are being undertaken by the president and others might manifestly be a sign of this decline. Again, Eric Wolf proclaims that although the empire might be in decline, the administrators are not conceding and accepting the characterization of decline. Instead, they continue to undertake what I consider to be catastrophic, to use Cornel West's terms, and irrational policies. So why don't we begin there? Take your time and parcel out the data, interpret the data, take position perhaps for or against. Eric Wolf, who is also a friend of yours, a famous analyst exactly like you. And let's begin there. How are we doing? How the American empire doing?
I would certainly agree that the American empire is in crisis, or let's say more broadly, I would say capitalism is in crisis. But the United States is the leading power in the capitalist world, and it's the country in which capitalism has been least restrained. And one of the manifestations of this, to me, is the very fact that the 2 dominant parties of the country can only throw up into their leadership such mediocrities, in the sense of people who have such a little capacity to actually manage the country. So this is in contrast to to earlier periods where people with various levels of skill, intellect, and so on, Roosevelt, Kennedy, etc. And there's been a certain decline since then. But I think that what's basically at issue, at the present time, in the case of the Democrats, the fact that no established Democrat, let's say no elected member of the Congress or Senate among the Democrats, is willing to challenge Biden, despite his incapacities, which are well enough known, and despite the disastrous consequences of his militaristic policy. He has been given credit for Democrats successes in the 2022 congressional elections. But I think that the Democrats did better than expected in those elections, not because of Biden, but in spite of him. They did so because of terrific mobilization of progressive people, precisely because of the fear of Trump and of the fascist tendencies that he represents. And this continues a long-standing practice with the two parties, the kind of symbiosis between them. The worse the Republicans get, the more extreme they get, the more unashamedly racist and misogynist they become, the more the Democrats fall back on the appeal. Oh, well, we're not as bad as them, so you better vote for us so as to prevent them from getting in. And this has a certain success. People feel alarmed, so they vote for the Democrats. But it's no credit to them because they're not managing the situation. And in fact, what Biden did as president, so many of the initiatives that Trump took, with regard to the border, with regard to the prosecution of Julian Assange, he continued them. He didn't repudiate them. He kept them in place. So the Republicans can do one thing, and the Democrats can make a lot of noise, but then do the same thing. And also, especially in terms of the environment, which is the core background issue to everything else. Everything else depends on the saving the natural environment. Biden went back on his key promises to stop new oil drilling and so on. So you have and of course, the other thing well enough known is his absolute insistence on pursuing the military campaign in Ukraine. So we have this disastrous situation, which portends all kinds of possible outcomes, some of which are too horrible to contemplate. And then on the other side, you have Trump and the Republicans, in a sense, totally, although some of them are challenging him, there's no real repudiation of him. There was the Republican Party almost unanimously supported him against the impeachment resolutions, the two of which were brought against him. So the Republican Party really is sort of in lockstep with the kind of extreme proposals that he presents. And so that's the situation you have with the two dominant parties. And then now we have, there are so many aspects of this to discuss, and I don't hardly know which to take first, but within the Democratic Party, since the regular established members haven't challenged Biden, and not even Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders said right at the beginning that he would not run against Joe Biden. He would only consider running if Biden withdrew. Since none of the established members would venture, even the progressive ones would venture to challenge Biden, there was this space which now has been taken up by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s candidacy is quite interesting in the sense that he does he has staked out a position that is, in some ways, I say in some ways, more progressive than that of Biden. In particular, he has a long history in terms of his career as a lawyer in litigating against big corporations for abuses and that type of thing. And the main thing that is held against him, and he's been let's say the target of tremendous amount of censorship and suppression because of his critique of the COVID policy and vaccines, for which there is a lot of evidence. And the reason he's been censored is that they don't want to actually carry on a debate about it with the evidence. They prefer to just try to keep him out of the public eye. But one of the things that's changed in the last few years is that being in the public eye no longer depends so much on the corporate media. With all the podcasts and everything, Kennedy has managed to get a lot of attention and therefore a lot of support. And although he has some areas of policy in which I would take issue with him, he's not very candid about tax structure policy. He's unapologetically apparently backing Israel against the Palestinians. And so he's not the perfect candidate. But on the other hand, his struggle against censorship and his struggle against the takeover of government agencies by private industry, in particular the drug industry, has given him powerful credentials, and he certainly has a level of competence, which I would say outdoes either Biden or Trump. So, without saying that I would support him completely, I think that just as someone capable of leading a process of revising in some ways the disastrous steps that have been taken, such as the militaristic policy in Ukraine, Kennedy represents some promise. Then now, in addition to that, I do want to mention the candidacy of Cornel West, our friend who's been on this show several times, and whose positions I certainly support. Of course, there's a whole big discussion about what is the impact of the Green Party on the positions of the other two candidates and so on. But I think a couple of remarks I would make in that connection is that in the persons of Trump and Biden, you have two of the least popular candidates of the dominant parties in the election. And recent surveys have indicated that a huge number of people, I mean, something approaching 50%, would rather vote for a third party, or at least would consider voting for a third party because of their, let's say, disapproval of both of them. So that's the situation in which we find ourselves. And of course, the US, because of its peculiar electoral system, makes it very difficult for a third party or a dissident party to gain a strong position in the contention. And even if its objective is not just to win, but just to show a respectable share of the votes, there's a lot working against it in terms of people voting for voting against what they fear rather than voting for what they want. So this is the kind of dilemma that we have. And of course, the other thing we have to remember, which is we all know but don't think about enough, is that this is not one presidential election. It's 51 presidential elections, each in each separate state and District of Columbia. And that's what the outcomes in the Electoral College reflect that. So it's a complex kind of process, which we could go into aspects of it if you want. But I mean, in terms of the basics, I think the main thing is that the dominant parties cannot put up a competent candidate. And to me, that reflects the fact that the conditions that they're committed to perpetuating, that is the conditions of US supremacy, don't allow for policies that can provide what's needed by the population of the United States. So they're always playing a game of trying to sort of maintain a good face on things while there's tremendous suffering in huge swaths of the general population.
Yeah. All right. There are many, many questions that this broad brush that you have taken in a remarkable way to characterize the American condition. What I would like us to do for the next 10, 15 minutes is address a two-pronged question that I have. Let me first begin and ask you, for the sake of educating me, the busy viewer, what, in your judgment, the manifestations of the decline of the American empire are? And the corollary question following that, addressing that, would be, how are these three candidates, outsiders really? One is an insider, namely Biden. The other two are outsiders, to steal a term that Sanders used to characterize his candidacy a few years ago. I would like us to summarize the platforms analytically of Biden, RFK, and Cornel West. That would be the second part of the question. But let's begin, and very slowly, for the sake of educating the skeptical public, what the manifestations of the decline of the American empire are. The basics.
To speak just of the most obvious things, you talk about the infrastructure, the roads, the transportation system, the fact that there's no decent rail system. I mean, all of these things are in comparison with China, and the fact that China is able, coming from a much more disadvantaged position, to greatly excel the United States in the level of its transportation system, is to me a kind of example. You know, there's a kind of deterioration. Let's say there's a neglect of the public sector. So that so much of the federal expenditure and energy goes into the military, because the U.S. military is, of course, there's more expenditures on the U.S. military than almost all the rest of the world combined, and so the point is that the military is sustained at the expense of the rest of the population. Everyone knows that the public health system is disastrous in terms of the overwhelming majority of the population. The fact that there's no system of universal health care, and that it's so inefficient that twice as much per capita is spent on health, and yet the health outcomes compared to other advanced countries rank pretty much at the bottom, taken on the overall average. Obviously, there's some terrific services within that, but taking the overall average, it ranks near the bottom with all this wealth. So, to me, whether you see that as decline or not, the point is that the system is not adequately serving its population. So the idea that you can both be the great military power and at the same time serve your population is disproven, let's say, to put it mildly. One of the other things I would say about that, and I don't know whether you'd call this decline or whatever, it's a characterization of it, but the fact of the tremendous emphasis on military and the whole culture that goes with that accounts for the social disorder, the climate of violence which exists on a daily basis, and the threat of violence that exists everywhere in the country. So I just heard the other day, there have been 360 mass shootings in just the first half of this year. So it's an average of 2 mass shootings a day throughout the country. I mean, I don't know whether you call it a symptom of decline or just a general characteristic. It is something that has its roots in the whole culture of the United States. But the point is that that the need for transformation is apparent at so many levels, and this is just one other level. But I suppose, again, coming back to the basics, the environmental crisis, the unalloyed commitment to perpetual expansion is something that has to be stopped as a matter of survival. More and more, let's say, those who understand what's happening with the environment are aware of that. And yet there's token gestures of recognition of that, but nothing is really being done about it. And so the condition is getting worse and worse. So, the other question you asked about the positions of the various candidates, well, I've alluded to that a little bit, and it can't do it completely. I mean, the position of Biden is, well, it's his record. It's what he's done in office so far, of which I would say that whatever progressive measures he has approved have been as the result of tremendous organizing pressure from below. I'm thinking of the Build Back Better, which was nonetheless quite sharply cut back from its original design. But on the other fronts, I mean, in terms of, well, I mentioned his going back on the commitment not to drill for oil. One could also mention that he's going back on the commitment to cancel student debts. I mean, that it was overturned by the Supreme Court, but his limited step in that direction. But he's not showing very strong tendency. He could have taken a much stronger stance on that as well. And he's basically sustaining or trying to sustain the status quo. So Biden represents what there is now. And Kennedy, I've mentioned the areas on which he differs, and I think one of the most critical is he's the only one of the dominant party candidates who have called for a non-militaristic approach, a negotiating approach to ending the war in Ukraine, which threatens to unleash really untold disasters. The rest of Kennedy's platform, I don't think it's really very well developed, but as I said, his record of being critical of the takeover of government by private corporations is an important one and a positive one in terms of indicating the directions that he would take. As for Cornel West, he presents a radical critique, a socialist critique of the whole system, which I certainly agree with. The question in discussing the election is how thoroughly or how well his campaign will be able to spread that understanding and what impact it will have on the general political outcome, which includes not only the vote, whatever vote that he can accumulate, but also its impact in helping to create the new movements which are desperately needed. Because I think one of the things that characterizes US politics is the overemphasis on elections at the expense of what can be done directly by popular organizing. Everything is made to seem dependent on the outcome of the elections, whereas actually the more basic question to ask is, what is it that determines the choices that are available in the elections? And that's a question of what will be accepted, tolerated, and so on by the population. And so Cornel West's campaign is significant not for the question for any possibility of his winning the office, but rather for what it contributes to the larger task of bringing about massive popular mobilization on behalf of transforming the society in a healthy direction. That's its true significance.
Let's now distinguish as carefully as we can the platforms of Sanders and Cornel. In what way are their platforms similar, and in what way are they dissimilar? And correspondingly, if Sanders faced tremendous hurdles to win, what chances are there for Cornel West, which you properly characterize as a radical socialist, to have a chance not only not to win, but to even have an impact on Biden, so that Biden's platforms would somehow be radicalized? Although I envision that to be a pipe dream.
Yeah.
The basic infrastructure of the platform is hopelessly capitalistic.
Yeah.
Radicalizing it without dismantling it is simply going to be a waste of time, I think.
Yeah.
But please disagree with me.
To begin with the contrast between Cornel West and Bernie Sanders, Bernie Sanders' platform was essentially a New Deal platform. His emphasis was entirely on the domestic policy and so on. And as distinct, the biggest single difference, I would say, is that Cornel West is strongly anti-imperialist, whereas Sanders sort of left that out of his rhetoric, and Sanders accepts the rhetoric of American leadership and that kind of thing. He accepts a lot of the standard rhetoric, even while offering very progressive domestic reforms on behalf of the working class and poor people. So there's that. In terms of the impact that Cornel West could have on Biden, it's not so much Cornel West himself. It's the question of the movement which he can help inspire. What impact can that have on Biden? And one can say at the edges, marginal. I don't think it'll have much impact on Biden himself. It will encourage him to make certain statements, just as he did in the 2020 campaign. It'll encourage him to present himself as a more progressive than he really is. But that wouldn't affect what he actually does in policy. I mean, I'm waiting for the moment when he'll decide to take a different tack in response to the military situation in Ukraine and get off this idea of winning and weakening Russia and all that, which can only lead to disaster. There has to be some kind of negotiated outcome to that, and he shows no signs of that. And I don't see these challenges as affecting that. I suppose there, I think Kennedy's challenge might be more directly relevant to Biden. But you see, of course, I mean, and this is the other thing, if you talk about symptoms of decline of empire, the very fact that the incumbent president is unwilling to have debate within his own party about for the nomination is itself a terrific sign of insecurity. I mean, he's afraid of what would come out in the debate. Not only does he refuse to have a debate, but they've, as you probably know, as your viewers probably know, they shifted the first state to have a primary. So it'd be one where within the Democrat Party, the machine supporting Biden controls the outcome. So there are all kinds of tricks that are taken to sustain a really unsustainable and I would say in some ways pathetic figure in this position of high office. So this is it's comic and tragic at the same time. I mean, but it's tragic at the basic level because look in whose hands the leadership of the country is, and with the biggest challenge coming from someone who is, namely Trump, who is so totally fascistic, to put it in a simple term, but who's I mean, he's erratic, but above all, he's unashamedly racist and misogynist, and the damage that Trump did during his time in office, especially in the courts, is there for all to see. And Trump coming back in would consolidate that even further. So I'm not saying that it's unimportant to defeat Trump, but I'm saying that the Democrats have failed to offer the kind of alternative that would inspire people and that would actually think that it could make a difference. And so much of Trump's previous policies were continued by Biden.
Mm-hmm. As you know, looking back on the Sanders candidacy, there are those analysts who were really heartbroken at the time, and they continue to be heartbroken even now. They recall the last days of the Sanders campaign, particularly what transpired in the Carolinas. Sanders was not thinking in terms of developing social movements, as he was thinking more in terms of internally radicalizing the Democratic Party so that it could embrace some components of his platforms, which of course from the very beginning was a very hopeless undertaking. But there are those who say Sanders simply did not have it in him to go beyond the Democratic Party and think in terms of social movements. Your contention, and I think it's the correct one, that what distinguishes Sanders from Cornell might be that Cornell might not win the election, but he might develop some kind of social movement that is going to continue challenging the Democratic Party, even if he doesn't win. And my impression is that maybe the Green Party and other independent parties could form a coalition and then organize social movements that will continue challenging, protesting, raising questions, raising issues, as was briefly done by the Occupy movement. Do you foresee the possibility of Cornell going beyond his candidacy and leading a social movement? If so, what kind of social movement is that social movement going to be? The form, the shape, the design, the place, the strategy, the platform, so forth and so on. And who are the key players going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not so much a question of what Cornell West will do, but what is done by all these other potential players that you speak of, I mean, what he's doing, he's already doing. He's posing a position. He's presenting a position which he hopes will inspire people. I would say that Sanders did have the idea of building a movement, but his movement was within the confines of the Democratic Party. I mean, after he lost the nomination in 2016 to Hillary Clinton, he formed an organization called Our Revolution, which you've probably heard of. But Our Revolution, although it has progressive positions on all kinds of domestic issues, it doesn't have an anti-imperialist position. And indeed, in his opening speech to that organization, he didn't say a word about foreign policy. And the political choices that it makes or that it works on have to do with candidacies within the Democratic Party. So Cornel West is obviously looking outside the Democratic Party, which is where the movement has to develop. What exact form the movement can take, I mean, this is very difficult to say. I mean, one can look at all kinds of formations that exist at the present time, expressed in different ways, whether it's the Democratic Socialists of America, whether it's the Green Party, whether it's the Socialist Alternative, whether it's various Black radical organizations. One of the characteristics of the left in the United States is that precisely that it's so fragmented. And you speak of a coalition. I think also the other component that has to be mentioned very importantly is the whole peace movement, which hasn't been developed very strongly. One of the leading groups is Code Pink, which has taken some very strong stances in that direction, and anti-imperialist groups like the Alliance for Global Justice. There are countless groups. The question of how all this can come together into a coherent movement is one that I wish I could answer, and no single person has an answer to it. I think the environmental issue, the issue of the environment, of saving the environment, is one issue around which it's more than an issue. It's the whole conditions of our existence around which all the groups should be able to come together. Whether it'll be possible to form a single organization that has a political direction and strategy and leadership, so that's very difficult. That's not something that can be accomplished by one person's candidacy. It's an enormous process which will require all kinds of meetings all over the country. I mean, the United States is a very difficult country in which to imagine this kind of change, precisely because of its inherent composition with all these separate political units, each of the states and so on. And what can be very strong in one part of the country will be undeveloped in another part, and there'll be all kinds of concerns that aren't addressed. But I think that what's happening, especially with this development of the podcasts, where you have really serious discussions of a kind that you never have when you have just sound bites on the corporate media, is at least providing a setting in which people can have the elements of a serious discussion. But I think the thing that needs to happen beyond that is that there have to be a lot more in-person, neighborhood-centered, workplace-centered gatherings of people on a continuing basis that recognize the basic surrounding issue, while at the same time having an immediate concern with whatever issues affect their own local or particular situation. So it's combining the local concerns, the workplace or neighborhood concerns, with the global concerns. And I mean, the connections, it doesn't take too much of an effort to see that there are profound connections there. And so that if the war in Ukraine leading to the manipulation of the prices of oil and creating economic crisis within the household and all that kind of thing, that all these things are connected. And obviously the forest fires and the damaging weather and the health consequences and all these things, that there are connections among all these things, but it requires people have to get together with and those who have some expertise in the various areas have to be willing to participate at the most basic level in instructional activities that help people confront these issues. But there has to be at the same time initiative from within the various popular groups. I mean, I hate to be so general and vague, but this is the basic type of process that has to take place. It's what has happened in any country where a revolutionary change has been brought about. It's because the masses of the people who usually don't get involved in politics, suddenly recognize, or maybe gradually come to, but increasingly urgently, they come to recognize that if they want the change to come about, it's going to depend on them. It's somebody else, somebody up there is not going to be the one to do it. It has to be one's collective self that does it.
I appreciate your response. And now the following, correct me if I'm wrong. One hopeful sign on the level of the radical transformation of language that I'm sensing in my own time now is that for the first time in American history, the word working class, socialism, which used to be disdainfully avoidable, are now gradually becoming part and parcel of discussing politics. I'm very inspired by this. I remember how difficult it was a few years ago to use the term working class, because each and every American has been educated to think that there are no classes in the US. Now, for the first time, even the media, perhaps reluctantly, but unavoidably, is beginning to use the term working class as signifying, symbolizing something or the other by which we can characterize parts of the American condition. The same linguistic transformation is also true of the word socialism. It is not a poisonous term anymore. In fact, the media is beginning to speak about socialism for the first time as something that you can think through, and in that it is meaningful, that it consists of an alternative of organizing American society, that it is not necessarily a term that should be avoided because it has nothing to do with American life. Thanks to Sanders, I think. He should be singularly given a credit for this. Certainly not Cornell. Cornell is plowing a seed that has already been developed for him. The term socialism now is meaningful. Your work, Eric Wolf's work, and many other prominent radicals who've been arguing for using socialism as a lens through which you can organize societies is now becoming part and parcel of our modern vocabulary. Shouldn't we be celebrating this and go beyond celebrating it and use it to be part and parcel of the platform, particularly Cornell West's platform, so that we can educate our viewers in a very responsible and detailed way what it means to think socialistically. What is your take on that?
Well, I would make one correction, which is to say that it's not the first time in American history that this has been the case. In the early 20th century, there was a very strong movement for socialism. Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate for president several times, he actually won 6% of the national vote in 1912. At that time, when the country had much less than half the population it has now, there was a socialist weekly newspaper called The Appeal to Reason, which had a circulation of 700,000 around the country. The early labor movement, the industrial workers of the world, were very strongly class conscious, and there was a great power of the working class. But the point is that whenever this happens, there comes repression. And so there was terrific repression that came after World War I. Then with the Depression and the rise of the Communist Party, once again, socialism and working class entered to some extent into the popular culture. But again, then there was the Red Scare after World War II, which suppressed it. So now you start the story after that. You start in the last 50 years. Then it does seem like something suddenly coming up, but it has been here before. But I agree with you that it's something that has to be built on, and I also would say that it's very much at the center of what the ruling class is afraid of. And I mean, Trump himself says that his whole thrust is to prevent socialism from ever coming about, and his biggest attack on the Democratic Party is to call it socialist. So it's very much in the vocabulary of politics. That doesn't mean that it's obviously universally favored. It will never cease to be controversial. But what I would say is that a wider percentage of the population is coming to look on it as a favorable alternative. And this has been, I think, true, especially largely since 2008. The meltdown, the financial meltdown, bank failure of 2008 was a kind of reminder of the essential incapacity of capitalism to serve people's needs. And since that time, and especially aggravated by the COVID crisis, there's been a dramatic increase in inequality in the United States. I mean, the inequality has reached points where it matches or exceeds the level it reached just before the 1929 stock market crash, which was vast inequality. So then you had a period of social reforms, again, inspired by mass organizations and demonstrations, which reversed the situation for a while and reduced the inequality. But then bit by bit, since the Red Scare, and then more so since 1980, all the gains, all the social gains, the reduction of inequality and so on, have been cut away or taken back. And so now we're again in the situation of crisis, where especially aggravated by the obvious environmental crisis, more and more people are aware of the need for a dramatic transformation. And so that's those are the conditions that we have to work with. And the challenge is how to use all the human talent and imagination and creativity to in an organized way, how to bring that together in a way that will make an impact and that will reduce the kind of, or let's say, well, I don't know, to offset the kind of culture that is so oriented towards aggressive competition and supremacy. I mean, supremacy, that's the constant rhetoric. I mean, whether it's Trump or Biden, they're both talking about whether it's make America great again or maintain U.S. supremacy against all challengers. Why is he so insistent on confronting China? It's not because China is threatening to invade the United States. It's because China is threatening to put the United States to shame. And he sees this as something that can't be accepted. He wants to do whatever he can to undermine Chinese progress by confronting them with military threats and so on. I mean, that was the basic way response to the Soviet Union too. Was that you militarily threaten it to a point where it diverts so many of its resources into its own military that it can no longer serve its population properly, and that was one of the things that contributed to its collapse. But the idea that the way to solve problems is to grow, which is the capitalist credo, which the Democrats as well as the Republicans are committed to. This is the assumption which has been so decisively challenged by the environmental breakdown, by the declines of species, extinctions of species from insects on up, and all the climatic disasters we witnessed, the breakdown of biodiversity. This is a matter of such great urgency, and it's a question of whether and to what extent all the population can become aware of it and become aware that if something is to be done about it, it depends on us. It depends on all of us collectively.
Okay, and finally, My last question, we have about 10 minutes left, and I would like you to take your time and develop a detailed response to this question, which is this. As you know, one of the most provocative components of Cornell's platform is his promise that he's going to go to Trump's country, as you put it, and then try to use reason to convince the working class, components of the working class, who voted for Trump, whom he contends are wounded, in despair, hurt, angry, confused, anxious, nervous. The list is quite long, by a very carefully worked out language of dialogue, free of domination. I applaud the project. I even think it's doable as a philosopher. But I'm just wondering if the fact that Cornell is a committed socialist, and also, for lack of a better term, Black, two dangerous dimensions of the self in an entrenched culture such as this, in which race is so deeply intertwined with what it means to be an American. I'm just wondering if this might not complicate the possibility of Cornell being taken seriously, which I contrast directly, for example, with that of Obama, who was neither a socialist nor a radical, but Black, but harmless, I think, subservient to capitalist ethos at the time, because of which he became accepted. I'm willing to be challenged. I'm summarizing and asking a question at the same time. Take it on, please.
Yeah, well, just as background, I would mention two considerations, in terms of the question of Cornel West speaking to Trump constituents. At the time of the 2020 election, there were a number of interviews which disclosed individuals, especially in poor working class communities, white working class communities in the North, Midwest, of people who had twice voted for Obama, but who were so disappointed by the outcomes of his policy that they then voted for Trump. So there's one collection of Trump voters. I don't know how big it is, but there's certainly some people who voted for Trump who weren't put off by the fact that Obama was Black. The other thing about the promise of speaking to going into Trump territory, I mean, there will obviously be some individuals within that constituency who won't even listen, won't even give him a chance. But the other thing that stands out in my mind is what Bernie Sanders was able to accomplish also in crossing that boundary, because I witnessed the video presentation of a talk he gave, I think it was in West Virginia, hosted, I believe, by Fox News, with a mining community that were all set to be against him. But as soon as he spoke in concrete terms of the types of policies that he was advocating, they were all for him. And the Fox News hosts were somewhat embarrassed. They didn't expect the crowd to be supportive. So I think that what might help in terms of actually getting into Trump territory is if Cornell assembled a delegation, that it wasn't just him, because there has to be the sense of an organization, and he can be the leading spokesperson for the group. But if some individuals that the constituents can identify with accompany him and show their support for him, I mean, that's just realistically, no matter how reasonable you might be, there are some people who will be disinclined to listen to you, and there has to be a credibility that's based not on the quality of what you're saying, but just on who you're perceived to be. So I think there are ways of doing it. I'm not sure how he's going to do it, but I'm sure he'll be able to find some people. It could be, in other words, it's a collective enterprise. I mean, he can be the leader of the process, but it has to be a kind of, well, the Rainbow Coalition idea, which again is originated with the great Black Panther organizer Fred Hampton, who was assassinated by the FBI in 1969. But the great danger that he represented was that he was organizing across all racial and cultural barriers, and was doing so successfully. And there's actually currently an attempt to revive that by the new African Black Panther Party. It's on a small scale so far, but who knows where it'll lead. But I think that there's a recognition. What that reflects is a recognition that there's a common class interest that overrides the fabricated differences based on ethnicity and culture.
Excellent. Well, our time is up, but before you leave, I would like to give you a forum to introduce your books in 5 minutes or so.
Okay. With pleasure. I have two of them I have here with me. At least this is my first one, Red Green Revolution, Politics and Technology of Eco-Socialism, which just came out in the second edition last year. And it looks into the whole question of what's required for the environmental transformation that we all recognize the need for. And it takes up some of the questions of technology, questions of who can be organized and led into it. There was a second book called Democracy Denied, 5 Lectures on U.S. Politics, which takes up some of the questions we discussed in this conversation here. I don't have the copyright handy, but it's about the United States and all the peculiarities of U.S. history and U.S. culture, and why it's difficult to bring about the kinds of changes we need. It's a small book published by Africa World Press, which has had some success especially among some prisoners who've read it, because I do prison education. And the third book is this one called Socialist Practice, Histories and Theories, which brings together essays on a wide range of subjects written over a period of more than 40 years, but made into a kind of coherent presentation covering not only issues of revolution and counter-revolution, issues of voting strategy, cultural expressions such as films, and all kinds of things. It's too much to summarize. But if you look at my website, you'll at least see looking up on the web, Victor Wallis with IS at the end of Wallis, you can see the books there, and I strongly encourage people to read them, and we'll welcome contact with anyone who does.
Well, thank you very much, Victor Wallis, one of the pillars of African Ascent International, for broad-range, penetrating and useful analysis of the American political condition this afternoon. Thanks for coming.
Great, wonderful. Thank you.